Yeah, that's the first time I saw you in action, and it was particularly good as well. I was a physio student at the time, so I was the knowledge sponge, and I was hungry for information. And the information you were giving me was very different from the education that I was getting at the medical school I was at in London, and it was kind of more in tune with what I was thinking. I'd already had a degree in exercise physiology and nutrition. I've been an army physical training instructor, so I was a fitness instructor. I trained lots of people, and then I was venturing as a PT, venturing into healthcare, and coming across things like the Czech Institute. Your work in particular, Grakovetsky, did I say that right? Yeah, Grakovetsky's spinal engine theory. All of a sudden, I'm like, how can the healthcare system and education process that I'm going through at the moment not know about this?
FC2O. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. Here we go. From chaos to order. From chaos to order. FC2O.
Welcome to FC2O. Today we have Dale Walker joining us, a soldier, nutritionist, physical training instructor, CrossFit enthusiast, university lecturer and physiotherapist. For many years, Dale was entrenched with some of the world's most elite fighting forces, including 2 tours of Afghanistan. As a speaker, teacher, clinician and mentor, Dale incorporates a holistic, patient-centered approach to rehabilitation and is a champion for using movement as medicine. A key goal for Dale is to work with health promotion and injury prevention so that we can change our behaviour as healthcare professionals from reactive to proactive. In this episode, we dive into Dale's work with the armed forces, key influences on his learning and practice, and how Dale has applied these learnings in the military, in the world of CrossFit, and in his role as a university lecturer. We dive into nutrition, barefoot training, functional exercise, and much more. Some of what you hear may surprise you. Enjoy the show. Here we go. Well, welcome to FC2O with me, Matt Wallden, and my guest today, Dale Walker. Dale, welcome.
Good morning, Matt. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, that's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. So Dale, well, I should just do a little introduction. Of course, you have a physiotherapy background, and you've been in the forces for how many years have you been?
Regular and reserve, probably about 22, 23 years. I'm getting on now.
Yeah, very old and wise. So when did you originally qualify as a physiotherapist? Was that pre-forces or was that during your time in the forces?
I left the Royal Marines to become a physiotherapist. So I qualified. Right. I started my physio qualification in 2002, graduated 2005.
Yeah.
Worked in the NHS for a year before going to Sandhurst and becoming a British Army officer. Physiotherapy officer, right. And then Headley Court and all around the bazaars.
Yeah, right. That's near me. What's happened to Headley Court these days?
Well, unfortunately, Headley Court has shut down, so all that history is gone. But things move on, things evolve, and it's Stanford Hall now, which is sort of Loughborough way. Which is a purpose-built building. It's meant to be fantastic. They've got things like the Karen system there, which is sort of
what's that?
It's like a kind of virtual reality walking space. So you can get gait analysis in this kind of space-age platform when you've got the VR helmet on and all that good stuff. We've got one here at Basic in Manchester.
At Salford University, is that, or is that?
No, it's outside Salford University. It's the brain and spinal cord injury research centre, which is just outside Salford Royal. So that's the only other Karen system I know. But and they've got all this. I think they're building the skill set that they had at Headley Court. I don't think you can ever replace that skill set that was at Headley Court because so many great minds were there. That's where I cut my teeth. That's where all my mentors were when I was a young physio. And I was just very pleased to be part of that era. But like you said, things evolve, things move on. Stanford Hall, Loughborough. I'm sure it's. I will take a trip down there at some point,
Yeah.
but I hear very good things about it.
Excellent. Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine. Right. Well, so, just to give people a bit of an outline for today, we're going to talk through a number of different areas where Dale and my careers have crossed over the last, well, it's getting on for 20 years. It's probably, yeah, 17 years, I imagine now. Because I think our paths first crossed in 2003. Now, I put on an event in 2003 with Serge Grakovetsky, the guy who wrote the Spinal Engine textbook, who is an incredible, kind of wizard of a man, a nuclear physicist who got back pain and then ended up uh, thinking that he'd need surgery, but getting advice from some of his medical friends to say, "I'd avoid surgery if you can." And so he went into trying to solve this for himself, and he ended up coming up with this amazing theory, which, as far as I know, still has not been refuted. And this came out in 1988, which is called the spinal engine, and the whole notion that the legs really move from they're amplifications of spinal movement. So that's quite an interesting thing, which maybe we can dig into potentially as part of our discussions. But so you came to that event, didn't you? Is that right?
Yeah, that's the first time I saw you in action,
Yeah.
and it was particularly good as well. I was a physio student at the time, so
Yeah. Yeah.
I was the knowledge sponge, and I was hungry for information. And the
Yeah.
information you were giving me was very different from the education that I was getting at the medical school I was at in London.
Right.
And it was kind of more in tune with what I was thinking. I'd already had a degree in exercise physiology and nutrition.
Right.
I've been an army physical training instructor, so I was a fitness instructor. I trained lots of people, and then I was venturing as a PT, venturing into healthcare,
Hmm.
and coming across things like the Czech Institute. Uh, your work in particular, Grakovetsky, did I say that right?
Yeah, you did. You
Yeah,
did.
Grakovetsky's spinal engine theory. All of a sudden, I'm like, how can the healthcare system and education process that I'm going through at the moment not know about this?
Yeah.
And there was a guy called Steve Hines,
Yes.
um, who's a Czech practitioner, and he was on the course with me. And he was the best at musculoskeletal. I was good, but I wanted to be Steve because he was better than me. And I was like, where did you get all this knowledge from? How do you know these things?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he was like, well, have you heard of this guy called Paul Check? I was like, yeah, yeah. I met Paul back in 2001. I've been following his
Right.
work for
Right.
a long while.
I was
And
going to ask, but when did you first see Paul's work? Was that online, or did you get a video or something, or what was
yeah,
it? Mm.
it was the video, the spinal stabilization, or I can't remember what it's
Yeah,
called,
scientific
scientific back
conditioning,
training.
scientific back training. Yeah,
VHS videos. I was
yeah.
working
Yes.
at BAE Systems,
Okay.
and I was one of the trainers there.
Yeah.
And then we went to FitPro. We saw him in 2001, and
Hmm.
then if we fast forward to 2003, when it was purely through Steve that I came to your conference, and
Yeah, yeah.
my God, did I get some knowledge bombs that day, and it really
First exposure,
started
wasn't it?
my journey toward, and to be in line with what you were doing already.
Yeah, fantastic. And how did it compare? Because I'm quite interested to hear it from your perspective. Because obviously, my background was I'd done an osteopathic degree before I saw the Czech system, and you were in the midst of your physiotherapy, but also had all of your physical training backgrounds. So when you saw the Czech information, did it? Because for me, it seemed not only what was missing from my osteopathic training, but it also seemed to have gathered, the very best of what I had been able to put my hands on as a researcher, doing my Bachelor of Science thesis and then my Master of Science thesis, and so I was fairly well versed in some of the very best rehab people on the planet at the time. And then I found Paul's work, and it was just he had taken that information and applied it to another level. And so that was what kind of inspired me to go into the system. But how did it compare with what you had seen through your sort of path?
Yeah. So I think when obviously I'm an academic now myself,
Yeah, yeah.
ironically, but really it was about implementation.
Mm.
And it was about joining the dots.
Yeah.
So when my students now, the best thing I can do as a kind of a coach or a mentor and as an educator is help them learn by joining the dots. Can you
Mm.
see that this is connected to this, which is connected to this, which is connected to this?
Yeah, yeah.
And because I did exercise physiology and nutrition,
Mm.
it was obvious to me that we need to be eating well and
Mm.
moving well at the same time, and those two were synonymous for me from that first degree. But when I
Yeah,
was doing my physiotherapy training, it was all about you know movement, exercise. It was very biomedical. But
yeah. Mm.
then we were lucky because we were in London at St George's as well. So we had two Australians that were there, one
Right.
Kiwi and one South African, and they brought with that kind of rich mix that you only really truly get in London. And it was Lester
Mm.
Jones who changed my mindset. I just come from the Royal Marines. I had a very kind of military mindset. If we're talking about spiral dynamics, I was very blue,
Yes.
and I was moving into orange,
Right.
and he helped me transition from blue to orange to green, um,
Mhm.
by teaching me the biopsychosocial method. And
Yeah.
I can remember these series of books in the old school libraries. Remember books, Matt?
Yeah, I do,
Yeah,
yeah.
called Topical Issues in Pain.
Okay.
And my brother had a disease called neurofibromatosis. So he'd had chronic pain his entire life, and
Right.
I
Yeah,
I was very interested in his journey and helping his journey,
of
and
course.
pain
Yeah.
was something that was really quite personal to me, but
Mm.
also it's important to everyone. So the fact that there was not just this biomedical model, that there was a psycho model, that there was a social model, and we might
Mm.
even move on to the biopsychosocial spiritual model that you and I both champion as well. And that
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
difference, is that rather than this, we were being taught reductionism
Mhm.
when we really wanted the holistic method.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but by that same rationale, it's difficult to teach the holistic method because you've got to know lots and lots. So if we
Mm, mm.
reduce it to, for this problem, we do a joint mobilization,
Yeah, yeah,
for example, and
yeah.
that using the Syriac's method or the Mulligan
Mm.
method, or any other method that begins with that's
Yeah.
antipodean.
Yes, exactly. I think this is a really interesting thing in education, though, isn't it? A really interesting challenge because, what I've seen many times now is that, you get true masters of a craft, true masters of a given field, and what they do is they obviously try and simplify things down so that it's understandable, so it's easier to teach, and quite often that involves putting things in boxes or in categories, and then of course people start to learn that and they get excited about it because it's the next thing, and you might get people really into, let's say, muscle imbalance, or really into core stability, or really into the biopsychosocial model or whatever. But because it's simplified down, I think then sometimes the students looking at it start to almost see the categories that have been simplified as the truth, as it were. And so, to give you an example of this, you know, tonic and phasic muscles. It was obviously something that Yanda talked about a lot.
Yeah.
And but I'm 99% sure that Yanda knew full well there's no such thing as a tonic muscle, and that all muscles have both tonic and phasic function, tonic and phasic fibers, and tonic and phasic motor neurons, but that they have a dominance one way or the other, And
Mm.
so I think he categorized it to simplify it so people could understand. And then the next thing is what I've seen in the last 10, 15 years, people saying, oh, Yanda, all that muscle imbalance stuff is wrong. It doesn't work because there's no such thing as a tonic muscle, or no such thing as a phasic muscle. And you're like, well, I'm sure he just simplified it down so people could understand it. And it wasn't, that he was saying there is such thing as just a purely tonic or a purely phasic muscle. But we have that challenge, I think, in all walks of education. This sort of simplifying to dumb it down, essentially. But if it's taken too literally, then of course people say, well, it's wrong, which is true, and it is dumbed down. It's not as accurate as it could be, right?
Well, I
So
think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of this kind of soundbite therapy
mm,
advice. And social media can be, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Yeah,
So you've got a lot of physiotherapists out there that are busy attacking each other rather than focus or attacking other professions for reasons unknown.
yes, yes.
When we're all healthcare professionals, we care
Yeah.
about
About
the
health.
and health and the
Yes.
patient.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think it can be very damaging when professionals are attacking each other for
Yeah.
for no other reason than one-upmanship.
Hmm.
I'm presenting at Therapy Expo again for this year in November, uh,
Excellent.
and I see myself as a therapist rather than a physiotherapist.
Right, right.
So working with sports rehab, working with massage therapy, working with sports therapy, working with physiotherapy, osteopathy, chiropractic, those into functional medicine, and let's be part of a bigger tribe rather than
Yeah, yeah.
petty infighting. Let's raise our game rather than be reduced to the level of petty bickering.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And so
Absolutely.
one of the other sound bites that you hear, and my students come to me with this kind of sound bite mentality, and it will say, "All passive treatments are wrong," by
Hmm.
Peter O'Sullivan,
Yes, yes.
who is I'm a big fan of Peter
Yeah, yeah.
O'Sullivan.
Yeah, me
I
too.
think he's doing some fantastic work, with his cognitive functional therapies and stuff like that. And what I like about um, his work is it's the complete polar opposite of kind of what a lot of people have been teaching verbatim, and it really
Mhm.
challenges the belief system around that.
Definitely.
What I don't like is the fact that he's doing his own research, proving that his method works.
Yeah.
Ironically, there's
Yes.
no unconscious bias in that research, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But they come to me with this example of Peter O'Sullivan, highly respected physio, someone that I'm a big fan of.
Mm.
Love his work. And they say get rid of all passive treatments. I'm sure he's been quoted out of context on that
Yeah,
one,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I would never. So the great thing about what I do is, rather than just as an academic, we also run a student-led physiotherapy clinic at
Mhm.
the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance, and here the students can see me in action as a clinician,
Mhm.
advising them. And they said to me, I can't believe the amount of hands-on manual therapy and passive treatments that you do. I thought
Right.
you were the exercise guy.
Right,
And I
right.
was like, well, you've got to do this in order for them to be able to move, or in
Mm.
order for them to be able to do the exercise. You can't just
Yeah,
do
yeah.
the exercise. What are your experiences of working with students and doing that sort of thing, Matt?
Yeah, well, very similar. One of the things that I guess when I first was heavily into corrective exercise and rehabilitation, conditioning, and so on, I perhaps did lean towards the idea that treatment was certainly overrated and perhaps in many instances unnecessary. And I wouldn't say that that's far from where I'm at now, but I remember one of the things that struck me at one point was that if you treat someone, if you think of how we talk about, if you're going to treat a patient, that's one way of saying treat. But also you say, I'm going to take my kids for a treat. I'm going to treat my wife to a meal out or whatever. So if we treat people, then we're spoiling them. It's like we're spoiling them. And if you spoil someone, then you ruin them, right? And I
Yeah,
know that's just playing with English language, but at the same time, what it's creating is it's creating a potential dependency on you. And so the beauty of the exercise approach is that, of course, you're giving them tools to get themselves better. And so you're empowering them with the right tools. And it's something they can do in their own time, so I think L. Liederman, in one of his papers, which obviously he's one of the more critical people of uh, manual therapy in particular, and he says that of course, most people would only go to have a treatment maybe once or twice a week for 30 minutes or so. So when there's 168 hours in the week, well, that means you've got 167 that you're not getting that influence. And so I totally agree with him on that. And that's where exercise and self-stretching and self-mobilization can be beneficial. But the flip side to that is that we are a very social species, and we are evolved from chimpanzees who actually touch each other. If you look at bonobos, and there's some serious touching going on there, but it's a means of pacifying ourselves, calming ourselves. But the sense of touch, and I think again, sometimes I can be a bit hands off, and then maybe I go for a treatment myself, maybe I get a massage or something, and you're laying on the table and you're thinking, oh my God, this is so potent and so powerful, so relaxing. I can't believe that I haven't been doing more of this work with my patients. I've been giving them all these exercise programs and lifestyle programs and nutrition. I need to get them on the treatment table more. So, I would say over the last few years, I've increasingly moved back to ensuring that I get at least some hands-on time with the client. As you say, it may be for a very objective reason that they've got restriction in a certain part of the body, and we can mobilize that out effectively using manual techniques, or at least set them off on the right track. But I think one of the key things in terms of manual therapy, and where manual therapists traditionally have been very, very helpful to people, of course, is in relieving pain.
Mm.
And a lot of that may be through their reassurance, through their manner, through touching the patient, letting the patient relax, explaining a story as to why the pain may be there. It might not be the right story, but it's still giving them something to hang their pain on. Um, and so, when you look at the model that Panjabi came up with back in the 90s, which is his model of joint stability, I think it's a really profound model, because what he's got neurology. It's a triangle. He's got neurology at the top. He's got the active system at the bottom right corner and the passive system at the bottom left corner. And so what he's talking about in the joint is, he's talking about, of course, you've got nerves, you've got the muscles that control the joint, and then you've got all the passive structures that hold the joint together. So they're what he calls the subsystems.
Hmm.
And so, when we're giving exercise, of course, we're dealing primarily with the active system, so the muscles, which are controlled by the neural system. So that's kind of where we're a little more focused on those two corners of the triangle. But the interesting thing that we've known for quite a long time, since at least the mid 90s, is that the active system can be divided further into the tonic component of the system, which is more the deeper muscles, the deeper fibers, which are more involved in stabilization and fine motor control. And then the phasic fibers, which are more superficial and more involved in moving you and generating power and torque around a joint. And so, but the pain inhibits the tonic fibers. So, where manual therapy, I think, can have a huge effect in terms of rehabilitating someone, is in helping to reduce the pain. So the pain is a neural uh, factor in their experience. And so what we want to do is, we want to work with the patient to reassure them, to put the hands on, to mobilize, to improve fluid dynamics, improve joint mobility, whatever it might be. And we can do that really effectively with our hands and with our clinical interaction. And then by decreasing the pain, now the rehab exercises are going to be more effective. And now the lifestyle change is going to be easier, because the patient actually has the space and the energy and the focus to be able to make those changes.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. I'd give you an example of back to my Headley court days, which is
Yeah,
the uh, when we were very lucky to be in a military system. It's tertiary rehabilitation center, so
yeah,
the soldiers are getting exercise throughout the day, hydrotherapy, balance and proprioception, endurance, cardiovascular conditioning. So they're basically exercising. And then
hmm,
parts of the day, they come and see me and we do some physiotherapy treatments.
yeah,
And we basically probably over-treated
hmm,
a lot of people. Some might say that we did too much of what we did. And I can remember having, I just done my acupuncture course. So of course, all my patients got acupuncture. I just done my joint mobilization course, so I'm spinal manipulating everyone.
yeah,
Um, you know, and then so we basically did our kind of our own audit, and I'd spend a day acupuncturing people or a day doing joint mobilization. But the day that I did massages, it was on everyone, was the day that everyone got better, regardless.
right, right, yes,
Which
yes.
is which is counterintuitive for a hands-off technique.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, what I was gonna um, sort of dip back into is that, of course, so we had this kind of initial crossing of our paths in 2003 with Grakovetsky there, and his whole thing obviously was this spinal engine concept. And to link in with Paul Check's work as well, one of the things that I remember hearing Paul talk about was that when you run, let's say in a standard running shoe on the road or something, he was saying this, and this was in 2001 when I first heard him speak in the UK. He was saying, as you strike the ground, of course, all the proprioceptors in the foot and throughout the lower limb are sending information back up into the spine, and of course ultimately into the cortex. And what Grakovetsky has shown mathematically is that the spine will spin based on the ground reaction forces coming up through the leg. And he said the moment you start playing around with the joint reaction forces by, for example, putting a cushioned shoe between you and the ground, well, the amount of mathematical computation that the nervous system has to do to adjust to that is just phenomenal, and the speed with which it has to do it. So he was kind of making the point. So no wonder low back pain is a lot of, is a very common injury amongst runners. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And I was aware of Grakovetsky's work at the time. But, one of the things that happened between 2003 and when you and I next met, which I think was around 2010, 2011, is that I ended up becoming the distributor of Vibram Five Fingers, the sort of barefoot minimalist shoes that look like gloves for feet, in 2007 to the UK market. So that kind of was set up as a parallel business to my clinical business. And so, of course, I dived right into all of the research around barefoot and so on. And, ended up speaking at various running stores and to various groups. So I had to really develop my thinking around it. And one of the things that actually struck me was that, when you run on a firm surface, like a road or like a firm playing field or a running track, then you get a certain amount of ground reaction force. And that, of course, comes up through the leg into the spine, spins the spine, and it takes you through into the next step, which is Grakovetsky's whole theory, that you're actually using the spine as a kind of energy storer and generator. So essentially, all of the viscoelastic structures of the spine, whether it be the discs that are rotating as the shoulder girdle and the pelvic girdle are counter-rotating during gait. So you're getting slight torsion and twist through all of the discs, which means you're getting slight compression of all the facet joints on one side. And so as you compress the facet joint, the cartilage within the joint is getting compressed, and then it will recoil back out. And those discs with their oblique fibers, they will get torsioned, and then the oblique fiber that's on stretch will recoil back. And so he's saying essentially, the kinetic energy is hitting the spine, being stored as potential energy, and then being unwound as kinetic energy. So you take the next step forwards. And that's his kind of spinal engine model. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is that then if you get someone to then go and run on sand, for example, like soft sand, then of course it's very fatiguing, first of all, but also where it's fatiguing and where it stresses the most is the abs, and in particular the obliques. So around this same time, I was working with an elite sprinter who was training with Linford Christie's group, and they used to go down to Wales every couple of weeks to train in the sand dunes, and they called it their core session. And the reason it's core session is because if you're running in sand, well, you don't get the ground reaction force. So because you're not getting this ground reaction impulse, the only way you can spin your body around for the next step is to use your obliques, right? So if you're not using this passive system, essentially, of harnessing gravity within the spine, then you have to use an active system, which is your muscular system, and in particular, in this case, the obliques. So I just thought that was kind of very interesting because, what you see with barefoot running is that people will tend to forefoot strike, which attenuates some of the shock and presumably tunes the right level of shock going up the leg and into the spine. But then if you put them on a soft surface, like sand or like, potentially even grass, then you might find, or you do find that they're much less likely to forefoot strike, and they may heel strike. So it's like the nervous system is adapting the amount of force coming through the leg in order to get the optimal amount of spin through the spine and not to overstress the spine. And that's how we move naturally in nature, depending on the substrate we're running over. But the moment you put a running shoe on, then of course you're always on a soft substrate, which means that practically everyone, somewhere between 80 and 90% of people, will heel strike when they're in a cushioned running shoe, which means now you're only really using kind of one of those systems instead of sharing load between forefoot strike, heel strike, maybe even midfoot strike as you're changing on different terrains. Well, now you're constantly on a soft terrain, so you're just repetitively hitting that same way of running, which again probably leads to increased propensity to injury due to just cumulative overload of that pattern. So I thought I'd just share that as a kind of link into the next time we met was in Hereford, and you're obviously working in the forces still with some of the military's elite there. And what had you picked up in the interim? Because obviously, our paths are kind of separated. I've been involved with the Five Fingers, and the reason I was coming down to Hereford was with the Five Fingers as the UK distributor.
Yeah, and thank you. I still have the Vibrams that you gave me. I still wear them.
Wow.
And they've been to Afghanistan with me twice.
Wow.
And yeah, I use them for deadlifting, which is
Right.
when I need that flat surface. Yeah, so when I was working with the military's elite, you were good enough to distribute some of the Vibrams to the guys. And I always think of soldiers as accidental athletes.
Right.
So they do all this athletic activity, but they don't really think of themselves as an athlete in the same way. They won't sleep enough because the job dictates that you have to do too much. They probably don't look after their nutrition as well. They rely a lot on protein powders, and because you might not be able to access good quality organic food where
I was
you
going to
are.
ask, how does that tend to work in the forces? Assuming you're not serving, if you're in the UK, are you being fed specific food by the forces, or how much of it is self contained, and how much of it is dictated by the forces themselves?
Well, it's all been contracted out to various
Right.
companies who will go for the cheapest nutrition because of the
Yeah.
volume of people they've got to
Yeah.
feed.
Of course. Yeah.
And a lot of the guys that are into eating clean and healthy will, and you've got to get there fast as well because military guys like to eat.
Yeah.
So
Right.
if you get there at the end of the lunch hour rather than the beginning, you're having salad again.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a whole separate subject about the nutrition side of things in the
Yes.
military. But going back to the original stuff, which is about the Vibrams, like I said, they're these accidental athletes. So you give them something like a Vibram Five Finger, and then they need someone like me, a physiotherapist, to tell them, no, you need to adapt to barefoot running. You can't just there's a transitionary period of probably 3 months minimum before you can go out and run any distance in these. And the guys literally the next
Absolutely.
day, oh yeah, I did a 10 miler with kit on
Right.
in
Yes.
the
Oh God.
Vibrams, and I was
Yeah.
like, you are just a lunatic. What did I say?
Oh no.
I said you got to build up to
And when you
running
say
in these.
yeah. So when you say with kit on, what could that mean in terms of to the layperson? Is that
Oh right, okay,
a
so they've
few
got,
kgs or a lot?
yeah, they got a 20-kilo rucksack on.
Right. Wow.
And they'd be up over the hills with it as well. I'm just
Yeah.
doing
Yeah.
insane stuff. And these guys are all in great shape. They're all
Yeah.
the military's elite. They're highly conditioned,
Mm.
but they don't look after themselves in the same way. They just go, well, I'm an elite soldier, therefore I can do this. The normal rules of adaptation don't apply to me.
Yes. Yes.
And we had to have some education and some conversations around that just to keep the guys safe from themselves. But the other thing, so there was the fact that they didn't want to spend the time transitioning, which was the whole thing with the barefoot running. When I went through the barefoot running process, it took me 6 months to a year to transition, and I did
Right.
it in a graded, careful, monitored way. With a little diary recording how I felt and which muscles I felt sore and all that sort of stuff. But that
Yeah.
was because of the geeky nature of being a physio.
Sure.
Whereas when we were doing things like speed and agility and jumping and plyometric stuff, those guys wearing the Vibrams, as opposed to those guys wearing normal training shoes, they were quicker, they were faster, they could jump higher.
Yeah.
All anecdotal evidence. I can only tell you what I saw in this very small cohort.
Yeah.
But it was clear that those that had what my ex-girlfriend, who was a professional dancer, would say, a better relationship with the floor.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
she used to say, "What's your relationship like with the floor?
Yeah. Yeah.
If you've got
Very
all
good.
this big padding in between you and the floor, your relationship is not very good."
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. So, I mean, just to sort of elaborate on a couple of your points there. Of course, because I was involved in selling the Five Fingers from 2007 to 2017, I was keeping up to speed with all of the research that was coming out, and most of it was very beneficial to in terms of supporting our whole discussion, because, of course, being barefoot ties in with evolution and how we've adapted to our environments to arrive at this point in time. But one of the studies that I recall seeing was looking at well, there's a couple of studies which relate. The first one was about lifting, and what they found that when you lift in Vibram Five Fingers compared to in a standard lifting shoe, you could lift more in the lifting shoe, assuming you're doing a static lift. So if you're doing a squat, for example, so in other words, your feet are static,
Hmm.
then what they found was the group could lift more, and I forget exactly how much more, but it was statistically significant in their lifting shoe compared to in a Vibram Five Finger. But the moment you start to add movement into it, you start doing things like jump squats or depth squats, then it switched. And so essentially, the moment the proprioception becomes more primary, let's say, or more important to avoid injury, then the guys in the Five Fingers, or in the five, they're all the same guys, but when they're in the Five Finger condition, then they could lift heavier. So that's really interesting, isn't it? Because essentially, the lifting shoe compromises proprioception. The
Yeah.
Five Finger doesn't. But the lifting shoe also gives you support, stability. It gives you a heel. And so the point is, okay, it's changing the biomechanics a little bit and the kinematics as a result of that. But also, if you imagine that the nervous system can only generate, let's say, 100 units of neural drive at any one moment in time, well, if you have to stabilize your feet and your back and carry this bar in the squat pattern, then you have to dissipate that 100 units of neural drive across the entire system. So that would be in the Five Fingers. But if you've got your feet stabilized within a supportive weight shoe, well, now you don't have to send so much neural drive to the feet, so you can lift heavier. You can send more neural drive to your prime movers like your hip extensors and your lumbar erectors and so on. So that was really fascinating and kind of ties in with what you saw. But there are a couple of other studies. One was a jump study, just looking at a vertical jump. And again, the guys that were barefoot or in a pair of minimalist shoes jumped higher than the guys that were in a tennis shoe.
Mm.
And again, this kind of comes back to what we were just talking about with the sand, or with any kind of surface that's squodgy or that gives when you push down on it. Of course, it dissipates energy, right? So then you can't get the recoil back up into the vertical jump. But if you're pushing down against the floor, either barefoot or in a pair of minimalist shoes, well, then you're not losing any of that energy into the structures of the shoe, and so therefore you can jump higher. And that's exactly what this study showed. But there were also other studies, in particular, there's one with netballers, which showed, and these were elite netballers, and they got them to half of the group to go in standard netball shoes and the others to go barefoot for a proportion of their training. And they essentially measured acceleration, they measured short sprints, I think it was 30 meters, agility, so they had an agility course, and they measured ankle stability and balance. And basically, in all measures, across 8 weeks, the guys that were barefoot improved statistically significantly more than the group in shoes. So it just shows, when the foot's allowed to do what it's evolved to do, assuming you do it sensibly, which is a big proviso and a big assumption, then it will start to function better and start to function more intelligently and more efficiently and so on. So kind of backs up what you were saying.
Yeah, no, I'm delving into the squat movement pattern
Okay.
at Therapy Expo. I'm presenting Bulletproof Your Squats,
Mm.
which is potentially dangerous for a physio to go into the world of squats and talk
Right.
about injury prevention.
Yes.
But one of the things is that we on a lot of people, they do need a heel raise in order to
Mm.
make the squat pattern just more efficient,
Yeah.
and making sure they're not going into spinal flexion and all sorts of compensatory mechanisms as well. But the other
Sure.
thing that a lot of them forget is that the coaching will generally be about weight back on your heels, weight back on your heels, keep your weight on the heels, whereas
Hmm.
you're not creating the arch in the foot when you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So we get them to drive down through their great toe, and then
Hmm.
obviously kind of push out to create that arch as the foundation of the squat. So the foot is
Right.
the podiatrist will love this. The foot is the foundation of the squat movement,
Hmm.
and everything begins with that proprioception from the foot that then
Mm.
goes up the kinetic chain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're coaching weight back on your heels in an elliptic limping shoe or any shoe with a big heel raise, then you can forget about the foot. And I deal with some pretty high level CrossFitters who
Hmm.
squat on a regular basis. They've got some good numbers up, but their foot position when you get them barefoot is is rubbish. You can almost lift their
Right.
toes up. So they're leaking power by not creating this stable base. And that's where things like wearing the Vibrams or barefoot training would benefit them massively in terms of proprioception.
Hmm.
And that's what they don't see. They just see the load.
Yeah. Yeah. So, one thing that I was going to ask you about is you mentioned nutrition, and I find it kind of interesting that a lot of some of the really cracking nutritional studies of the last century or so have come from the military, because, of course, my understanding at least is that when your soldiers are out at war, one of the things that's most likely to win that war for you, one of the key things, is if your soldiers are well fed and if they're actually able to perform. And so there was, I'm sure you've heard Paul Check speak before about Major General Robert McGarrison and his various studies. I think he did a lot of it on rats, to be fair, but it was also based on his observations on his travels and so on. But he was looking to find how different foodstuffs influence behavior, influence performance, and so on and so forth. And that was a obviously he was working for the British Army at the time, and it was all about optimizing the kind of functional capacity of the soldiers. So it's interesting that it almost feels like we've got to a point where we kind of got a school canteen mentality with the army, but I guess that's always going to be the nature of feeding a huge group of people.
Well, the flip side of that is the ration packs. So when you're out
Right.
on exercise or in a remote location somewhere,
Yeah.
the ration packs in the last 20 years have improved phenomenally.
Okay.
And a lot of the time, it's just being embarrassed in front of the Americans. So the
Right.
Americans 20 years ago would come over and they're like, "What is this rubbish you are trying to make me eat?"
Yeah.
Like,
Apart from they say trash, they wouldn't say rubbish.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
this trash, this poison, like
Yeah.
cans of spam,
Yeah.
corned beef hash, biscuits
Right.
brown, and all these kind of old school things that we just kind of got on with it, and it wasn't very healthy. It
Yeah.
and the studies were done purely on calories,
Hmm.
assuming that all calories, whether they come from whatever macronutrient, are the same.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and 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 we know that that's probably inaccurate. But
Hmm.
so we've gone from this, and the Americans have these meals ready to eat, the MREs, which were much nicer and much tastier. So
Hmm.
the new ration packs that we have are phenomenal now.
Right. Right.
Obviously, we cater for vegetarian and vegans.
Hmm.
We there's all sorts of things on the menu now. It's absolutely delicious. They would, I would happily eat a ration pack now,
Right.
because they are phenomenal. So in terms of the man out on the ground, the ration packs are better. But um, you know, good quality food in the officer's mess if you're lucky to be an officer, but in the normal dining halls as well, the food quality is still cheap and cheerful simply because of the volume
Yeah,
of
yeah.
people they've got to feed.
Yeah, I mean, you wonder, because obviously in the schooling system, certainly here in the UK, partly off the back of Jamie Oliver's attempts and various other sort of media pressure, it does seem like there's an increasing push towards higher quality foods. Obviously, it's still being done on a budget as best it can, but I know a lot of the sort of state schools now have organic foods within their menu. Obviously, it's not all organic, but it does seem like there's a little bit of a change in the way things are being seen. So I wonder if that will happen in the forces as well.
Well, I'd certainly like to see that as well. But the other thing is that what's steeped in tradition is the dessert, or
Right.
we used to call it duff.
Okay.
So you'd have like apple crumble and custard or something like that, and it would not be unusual for people to double duff, which is
Right.
have two desserts. And
Yeah.
particularly when I was in the Marines, we'd eat 4 times a day. They'd have something called 9 o'clockers, where
Right.
we'd eat our fourth meal of the day at 9 o'clock. And
Hmm.
we were just trying to get in as many calories as we could. I
Hmm.
went down to something like uh, probably about 11 and a half stone. I'm
Wow.
sit comfortably at 14 stone, and I was just
Hmm.
sort of skin and bone, just sinewy
Mm.
muscle tissue. Ironically, probably stronger and fitter than I've ever been.
Right. Right.
But it was interesting. So the Royal Marines pioneered this kind of eating 4 times a day, and that
Hmm.
significantly avoided injury. I know the Navy SEALs have a system where they're allowed to eat as much as they like through training. The same with, I think, our Special Forces selection. They have these fantastic feasts because
Yeah.
they know that you're just burning so many calories. You need that good quality nutrition. So I think
Right.
in
Right.
some places in the military, you'll get higher quality nutrition than
Hmm.
others. But
Yeah.
there's also a big push towards things like protein powders because after you've done your physical training, you probably haven't got the opportunity to eat. You've got to go to work or you've got to do another task. So
Right.
you can probably get away with a protein shake rather
Hmm.
than an actual meal because there's no way for you to cook. There's no kitchenette or anything like that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, tying in with that, because you mentioned earlier vegetarians and vegans and catering for them. What's your experience been with people that are putting their bodies through that much stress and eating a vegetarian or vegan diet? Do you think that's sustainable in most cases, or did you see challenges with keeping up with for example, the body being able to repair and get anabolic again on these diets?
Yeah, I've got some bias in the sense of that, a very good friend of mine is a vegan, so
Yes, yes.
he educates me a lot about being vegan and training and how he needs to be cautious with what he's eating, making sure he's getting higher protein and good quality nutrition.
Hmm.
So in a place like the military where you eat as much as you can,
Hmm.
because you never know where your next meal is coming from.
Yeah.
It would be much harder to be vegan. Probably fairly easy to be vegetarian. I know quite a few vegetarians in the military now.
Hmm.
Um, so and the old vegetarian rat packs as well that the Gurkhas used to have, they would taste the best anyway.
Oh, really? Okay.
So um,
Yeah.
as far as what happens is you kind of get this group mentality where the energy of the group keeps everyone going,
Hmm.
regardless. As long as they've got enough calories in,
Hmm.
they will continue with everyone else,
Right, right.
because the
Yeah.
group mentality, the strength of the group, brings them along.
Excellent. Okay, okay. Yeah, no, Paul Check and I have just done a podcast which isn't out yet, but we've done it on we called it The Honest Vegetarian, and so we were looking into a lot of the challenges of vegetarianism, and things like obviously fat soluble vitamins, which are very difficult to get hold of if you're not eating meats and animal products, and yeah, some of the common myths around vegetarianism and veganism, but also meat eating as well. We weren't trying to be anti-vegetarian. We were just trying to put up as much sort of objective evidence as we could, as well as looking at it from multiple angles, because quite often the rationale for why people choose to eat that way may be um, either misguided or misunderstood or whatever. So we dig quite deep into that, and I was just wondering, whether you had seen anything in terms of, you know, deficiencies or difficulties repairing, but it sounds like not particularly. Has that been your experience?
Well, it's really just, your body's breaking down when you're in the field. So
Mm. Mm.
making sure you've got enough multivitamins, like the effervescent multivits,
Right.
would be, I used to consume those daily.
Hmm.
I used to supplement as well with, cod liver oil, glucosamine
Hmm.
sulfate back in the day, whether it worked or not. I felt better for taking it. Placebo, you can look at it like that. But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
the main problem is that we have got a sugar addiction in the military.
Mm. Mm.
And indeed,
Yeah.
society. The military reflects society. Society, the military, and no matter if you're vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, or a carnivore, we've all got an issue with sugar,
Yeah. Fair enough.
particularly
Okay.
sugar, and things like tendinopathy
Mm.
are a big
Mm.
one. And then there's some interesting stuff coming through about things like gelatin and gelatin
Yeah,
flakes for tendinopathy, and
that's it.
supplementing that.
Yeah. Well, we just wrote a paper on that actually. Mark Sisson and myself. So Mark, I'm sure you're familiar with, but he's
Yep.
one of the sort of leading lights in the paleo world, and we co-wrote an editorial and a practical paper for the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapy. So that's in the current edition, and. Yeah, unfortunately, it's behind a paywall. So if anyone's listening to this and wants a copy, they'll have to email me direct. But I'll leave details in the show notes so you can access them. But yeah, I can certainly send them out if people are interested. But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of evidence that shows that when you eat collagen, which is somewhat rare these days in the sort of modern diets, that it gets absorbed, first of all, and second of all, it turns up in the places where you need it, like in your skin, in your tendons, and so on and so forth, in your cartilage. So it does seem that our diet has become somewhat devoid of collagen because we tend to go for the prime cuts of meats. We tend not to use, stewed meats and slow cooked meats and bone broths and things like that so much anymore. And actually, also a lot of gelatin is even being removed from desserts where it used to be used, and being removed from sweets and stuff. So people could get gelatin through jelly type sweets and jelly type desserts. But even that's starting to be removed in favor of vegetarian style products. And so, we have a real collagen deficiency in terms of what we're actually taking on board. So, when you're stressing your connective tissues, which of course is one of the key things that, linking back to the barefoot running, that's when we were telling people about transitioning to barefoot running, as you alluded to with the soldiers, if you do it too quick, you get injured, because as much as there's a strong evolutionary story for going barefoot, our individual evolution as individuals, how we've grown up and what we've done with our feet throughout our lives is going to dictate how effectively and how quickly we can adapt to that. And of course, the slowest adapting tissues are the connective tissues. So we always used to recommend actually that it would be somewhere probably between 6 and 18 months for people to fully transition into a barefoot or minimalist style of running. So
And what we're seeing now is this kind of the reverse now. The maximal. Some of my students have got so much cushioning between them and the ground. It's almost laughable.
yes.
And the whole barefoot movement was about minimalists for a reason. So you had this better relationship with the floor.
Yeah.
Now with all these maximalist shoes, how can you feel anything? What are your views on that quickly?
Yeah. Well, I've mentioned it on a couple of the other podcasts as well, but to just reiterate, well, first of all, what the maximalist shoe idea was that we're going to take kind of the best parts of being barefoot, which they see as essentially having a zero drop in the shoe. So one of the things that the whole barefoot and minimalist footwear movement spawned was the idea that pretty much every shoe that we wear, whether it be a dress shoe or, obviously for women, more high-heeled shoes. Well, not necessarily women, but there are more high-heeled shoes. Whoever wants to wear them, and then, but also running shoes have what's called a heel drop. So essentially, the heel is higher than the forefoot, and in most running shoes, that's about 1 centimeter in most cases. So it's quite significant. And of course, what that does is it almost forces the heel strike that we were talking about earlier. And in normal standing, of course, it pushes your weight towards your toes, towards the forefoot. So it means that you become a little more quad dominant in the way you activate your muscles, which inhibits the glutes, of course, if you're quad dominant. So there's various sort of rationale where you look at a standard running shoe or training shoe and you think, that's not really a very good idea to have that heel drop. So what the maximalist guys did was they said, so we're going to take that concept, we're going to make our shoes completely flat, but what we're going to do is we're going to add cushioning and we're going to double up the cushioning. So it's like one of the sort of strap lines was it's like running on clouds kind of thing, you know. But the problem with that is that the human nervous system is designed to tell you where you're at in space. And so if it can't feel where it's at in space, then it will hit the ground harder in this instance to try to find where the solidity is. And we've known about that since 1984. Nike knew about that since 1984. They published papers from their research department showing exactly that. The more cushioning you have between you and the ground, the harder you hit the ground. So when we look at it in those terms of the nervous system, it makes perfect sense. But yeah, there was a research paper that came out maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, when the maximalism thing was just really taking off, by Irene Davies, and she basically showed that when you're barefoot, you have the lowest loading rate through the leg as you run. Put on a running shoe, it's somewhere between doubles and triples the loading rates, and then you put on a maximalist shoe, and the loading rate went so high they couldn't measure it on their accelerometers. It actually kind of broke the system. So
wow.
So it just goes to show, the more you sort of play around with human biomechanics and how it's evolved to function, the more likely you are to get off track. And I think that's exactly what happened in that situation.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and we actually, I think the next time we met after Hereford was in London, and I don't think we realised that either of us were there at this conference. I forget what it was called now, but Daniel Lieberman was there, and Ben O'Nig, and some real big names in the world of I guess gait biomechanics and foot biomechanics and so on. And it was as we were leaving, we bumped into each other on the tube train, didn't we? Do you remember that?
We did. It was a bit of serendipity, a bit of synchronicity.
Yeah. And so you were then at that point able to sort of give me a bit of feedback on what had been going on with the shoes, with the soldiers you've been working with. It was just a nice, like you say, serendipitous catch up on the train. But off the back of that, I think we started to stay in touch a little bit more. And somewhere around 2016, we met up in Manchester because with the shoe business, what we had decided was important for the Five Fingers was to try to get more involved with the whole CrossFit scene. And I was aware that you had become involved in the CrossFit scene. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you got involved with CrossFit and where you're at now with it?
Yeah, obviously, I have a love affair with CrossFit. I really enjoy it. So it was back in Afghanistan in 2010 when I was treating all these US Marines. They were coming in with shoulder problems. And I was like, where are you getting these shoulder? But they were coming in on a daily basis. Where are you getting these shoulder problems? And they said, oh, we're doing CrossFit. I was like, okay, that you're doing some sort of cross training. And you go, no,
Yeah.
we're doing CrossFit. Okay, so
Right.
they eventually took me down to their gym, and there's a particular workout called Fran, which is about kipping pull-ups and thrusters.
Okay.
So obviously I didn't know what a kipping pull-up was apart from my gymnastic days, so I did a kind of modified version of these. So I did that. It was incredibly difficult. I took much longer. They kind of laughed at me, and then probably for the next 5 days I had significant delayed onset muscle soreness. I was unable to move my arms above my head. I had trouble washing my hair,
Right.
and I couldn't believe that such a short amount of intensity had created so much catabolic muscle
Jumps.
damage.
Yeah. Wow.
And after that I was just hooked. But I didn't start CrossFit proper till about 2012. I just got into the whole thing. Again, in the army, we were seeing lots of shoulder and low back injuries. And then I began to understand it. I did my level 1 qualification, and then got the opportunity to work for CrossFit in Berlin as the physio for the Invitational, so working with all the high level guys, Rich
Right.
Froning, Sam Briggs, Camille LeBlanc-Basnet, and then I started doing loads of competitions. So where I was the physio at this competition, and then I went to CrossFit regionals, and I must have worked probably 200-300 different
Wow.
competitions. And what I did, because I'm a bit of a geek, is I gathered all my data together
Mm.
from every event, and I did like a post event analysis. Where were people getting injured? And that was very much depending on the ward, the workout of the day.
Yeah.
So the then I went on to do my master's in project on functional movement screening and
Mm.
CrossFit. Could we predict who was going to get injured in CrossFit from the functional movement screen? Unfortunately, we couldn't. But what it did
Right.
highlight is, so I followed 100 recreational CrossFit athletes for 6 months. What it did highlight is the shoulder and the lower back were vulnerable. And then
Mm.
my audit from these 300 competitions showed that the shoulder and the lower back were vulnerable, and then the literature also mirrors that. So I had 3 pieces of evidence, and now I run
Yeah.
courses, bulletproof shoulder, bulletproof back, for just dealing with these particular issues.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I'm there as an advisor to stop people getting injured in the first place. In many ways, the same sort of advisor you were for barefoot transitioning.
Yes. Right.
I don't know whether you
Okay.
have any advice for me about what worked well for you in
In
helping
terms of,
people adhere to your ideals about the health of the transition.
yeah. Well, okay. So whether they actually followed what we were advising, or do you mean to actually
Yes.
sort of give? Yeah. Well, I guess I suppose it's difficult to know unless you're auditing it, which I wasn't. So because I was involved in distribution, I guess what it was primarily my role was going out and speaking at a running store that had just got the shoes on board, or even some. I mean, Run and Become in central London. I think I did 30 or more presentations for them across several years. So but the point is, you're going and speaking to a group, and they're probably not going to see them again. I did get some, obviously, again, over the years, many lovely emails from people saying how their back pain had gone, or their knee pain had gone, or the advice was useful. So anecdotally, there was at least some benefit to people. But I think certainly there were a lot of stories of people jumping in too quick, ending up putting additional stress into, because what happens when you barefoot run is that because you tend to forefoot strike. So most people will tend to switch straight to a forefoot strike, which if you already forefoot strike, because some people just do that naturally, but only quite a small percentage will do that naturally at, let's say, a moderate pace. When you start to sprint, everyone tends to forefoot strike, but really at a moderate running pace, it's like I said, about 90% of people will heel strike in a running shoe. But so the point is, if you're switching from heel strike to forefoot strike, then what you're loading a lot more is, first of all, the second met head. Okay, so you're putting a lot more load through the metatarsal heads. You're putting a lot more load through the plantar fascia, and you're putting a lot more load through the Achilles tendon. But reciprocally, that means that you're relatively unloading the knee, unloading the hip, and unloading the low back. So quite a lot of the time, people with knee, hip, low back issues because of running, they start barefoot running, it seems to improve their issues. And probably because they're injured, they're not going to push themselves too hard either. But if you're relatively fit and healthy and you just jump into a pair of 5 fingers or go out barefoot running, well, in fact, it's more so if you get into a minimalist shoe, and I'll explain why in a moment. What people tended to do was to go, oh, wow, this feels really nice. It feels really efficient. I feel more springy because I'm forefoot striking. And so then instead of following the advice that you recommended, they tend to go and, as you said, do 5K or 10K with this forefoot strike, which they've never really used before. And so the upshot is they end up with sore Achilles, maybe sore calves, sometimes sore plantar fascia, certainly sore second met heads is very common as well. So those are the kinds of injuries that people would pick up. And, I mentioned just a second ago, that tends to happen more in minimalist shoes than it does if you're actually barefoot. And the reason that's the case is that if you're actually barefoot, then the thing that tends to limit your run in terms of the actual the total distance you'll cover is not your Achilles tendon or your plantar fascia, but it's the skin on the sole of the foot. So the skin tends to be your rate limiting factor, if you like. So if you imagine most people in this day and age, if they were to take their shoes off and go out for a run, they're not going to get that far before the sole of their foot starts to feel a bit blistery, a bit uncomfortable, and they're probably going to stop at that point and either walk back, or maybe they're carrying their shoes in a backpack or whatever, and they'll stick them on their feet at that point. But so if you're thinking of transitioning to barefoot, it is a better idea, if you can, to actually go purely barefoot as opposed to going in a minimalist shoe, I would say. But yes, back to the original question, I would say that it was probably, taking a complete guess, I would say it's probably less than 50% of people that would actually follow the advice fully in terms of making that transition.
Yeah, that's pretty similar to what I've got. And what I did was, what I always do is I divide sort of my athletes into 4 categories. So you've got the beginner, someone that's new to barefoot running or someone that's new to CrossFit, and they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to injury because they haven't got the motor skills, they haven't got the physiological adaptations, and then after they've been doing that 6 months, a year, whether it's CrossFit or barefoot running, they're kind of recreational. They have adapted to the load, and as long as they stay at that load, then in actual fact they're relatively risk free. And then the next level of vulnerability is when they want to do a race. They've got a 5k race or 10k race coming up, or a CrossFit competition, and they up that training load again, and that what makes them more vulnerable. And then finally, that there's the elite category who are the genetic freaks. They're symmetrical. They've been adapted to the task for a long period of time, and they can run 5k 10k barefoot every day. They can CrossFit every day, and it doesn't really seem to make any difference. Have you found something similar with your guys?
Yeah, I would say that's certainly been the case. I mean, we had a guy who was an elite runner. He was a what's it called? Trying to think of the Hawaii Ironman. It'll come to me in a moment, but it's where they do the World Championships in Hawaii every year. And so this guy was in the category. It's called Kona, isn't it? Kona.
Yeah, that's right.
So he had qualified for Kona a few years in a row in his standard running shoes, but he'd ended up getting an issue with one of his flexor tendons in his foot, and so he'd had to have surgery on it. And the surgeon, of course, himself had taken various MRI scans before doing the surgery and so on. And then this guy basically said, whilst he was rehabilitating, he was looking at the fact he had qualified again. This was probably around 2010, 2011, but Kona was only 3 months away. And he was thinking, can I get myself back up to the fitness level to compete in the World Championships? Given the fact I've just had surgery. And so because he couldn't train, he was reading around and he found all this information about barefoot running. So he approached us to see if he could get a pair of 5 fingers. And we said, sent him a pair and, explained the transition. And he transitioned, like I say, in 3 months. So he ran, I mean, of course he was a super elite athlete prior to his surgery. So he obviously had a tremendous base, but he went straight into wearing the 5 fingers. And 3 months later, he's competing at the World Championships, and he got through the whole thing, no problems. And from that point on, he was sold. He basically wore the 5 fingers every year from there on in.
Wow.
But the interesting thing with him was that I got to meet with his surgeon probably 4 or 5 years down the line, because this surgeon is one of the few foot surgeons in London who is very pro barefoot. He said most of his colleagues are still very much on the orthotics bandwagon, as it were. Not to be negative about orthotics, but he had kind of, in his words, kind of seen the light that if you support something, it gets weaker, and if you allow it to work or encourage it to work, it gets stronger. And so he was now using this approach with most of his surgical patients in their rehabilitation. And he said, and the amazing thing with Steve, this athlete, was that he said, I've got the MRIs from before he came in, before I operated on him, and I've got the MRIs from him now. And he said, it's like a different person. because it's the foot's about twice the size because of the hypertrophy so not twice the size, of course, in terms of length. It widened quite a lot, but it's the thickness of it. And so all those intrinsic muscles, even the extrinsic tendons coming into the foot, everything had thickened right up. The skin had thickened up, the fascia, the fat pads. He said it's about twice the thickness of what it was before. It's just incredible. So I never actually got to see it, which is a shame. But so that's an example of an elite guy. We had another elite coach who worked with a lot of international athletes, and he did exactly the same. He recognized the benefits of forefoot striking in terms of minimizing impact, optimizing energy capture and return in the gait cycle, and that this tends to happen when you forefoot strike. And so, what he said. Sorry, that tends to happen when you wear minimalist shoes or go barefoot. So I don't know if you recall them, but there was a footwear brand called Newton's, and they got
I know them.
so they got fairly big for a period of time, and their whole concept was that they had shaped the sole so it really encouraged a forefoot strike when you run. So this guy had initially got all of his athletes to wear Newtons, and so he'd been doing that. And of course, they were all experiencing quite a lot of DOMs in their calves as a result of wearing the Newtons. So then the next thing was that he contacted us and said, "Look, I want to transition my athletes into five fingers. Could you come down and do some kind of deal for us?" So we did. We did a presentation. They gave them a deal with about 30 of them got five fingers, and they wore them again. And what they all said is that they got a kind of second round of DOMs, because whilst the Newtons had been encouraging them towards a forefoot strike, it wasn't nearly as acute as wearing a pair of five fingers, where they really went into a forefoot strike. And then even a couple of them went beyond the five fingers and went to barefoot running. And they said, and with that, they got DOMs again, because you're forefoot striking even more. So you're pointing your toe even more. So really kind of fascinating that, first of all, yes, elite athletes can adapt very well to these things, but also that at each stage of the progression, they were getting DOMs, because it's just that little bit more, I guess, kind of required by the nervous system to point that toe, the less you've got between you and the ground.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So let's stick with the CrossFit. One of the things I remember you saying when I met you that time in Manchester was that one of your observations with CrossFit at that point was that it was fairly heavy on the sagittal plane loading and not so strong, in particular in transverse plane, but I think also frontal plane loading to some degree as well. Has that changed at all, or is that still an observation that you would make?
CrossFit is constantly evolving, but it is very much sagittal plane based. They've done a lot at the games as well, because they do lots of different things as well, so it's much better. But the basic foundation movements as well is they're still lacking twists. So with the exception of the Turkish get up, for example, which is a really nice movement as well. But so the first thing I do, part of your functional movements, your first functional movement, your first primal pattern is the twist pattern, isn't it? Being able to just roll, and you're probably twisting in the womb.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So what I do is I just get them to get a medicine ball, and then just throw it against the wall, just throw and catch. So we're working plyometrically, we're working rotationally, we've got a motor skill of throwing and catching, and that appears to be enough just to get those systems working, because one of the contributing factors to their lower back pain, and most CrossFitters will experience low back pain, particularly as they begin to ramp up the loads, is that their thoracic spine is so stiff because they don't do any rotation and they don't do any thoracic extension.
Right.
And they won't, they're good at mobilizing and foam rolling and things like that, but they're just so stiff from all the sagittal plane stuff. Just getting them to do some simple throw and catch rotation it is a game changer for many of them.
Well, and of course, I guess that ties in with the shoulder issues as well, doesn't it? Because to get the arms above the head, you do need thoracic extension and thoracic mobility. And so, I say you do need it. It certainly helps to minimize stress in the glenohumeral joint and minimize risk of impingement. So it could be, like you say, quite a key thing in injury prevention as well as conditioning.
Yeah, I know that's a really good point. actually. But my observation from the shoulder is they spend so much time doing Olympic lifting, this kind of jump shrug movement. What they've
Mm-hmm.
done is they've developed a motor pattern where the upper trapezius works faster and is more neurally switched on than the lower trapezius. So as that
Okay.
proximal force couple, upper traps, lower traps, serratus anterior work, because they haven't trained serratus like we would in gymnastics, because they haven't trained lower traps, because apart from on the rings, you're not really doing a lot of isometric lower traps work. You end up with
Sure.
these huge dominant upper traps that just that they're the initial movement of any glenohumeral joint, and it's
Yes.
effectively creating dysfunction through repetition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Makes sense.
That,
Okay. One other thing I was going to ask about in terms of the CrossFit is that I suppose an observation from my end of some of the early CrossFit I thought was it concerned me because it didn't look very well controlled, and there was lots of terrible form issues and so on. But I think they've really got on top of that now, haven't they? I think form is actually there's always limitations in a group environment, of course, but it does seem like form is very carefully focused upon these days. Is that true to say, or would you say
yeah, well,
there's
the
issues?
quality of there's a big thing about to become a level 1 trainer is like a 3-day course,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
the exam's quite tough. So you can just come off the street, do a 3-day qualification, and open up a gym.
Right. Okay.
But what they don't see is that anyone that did that, you've got to be a player in the game to open a CrossFit gym.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
You've got to have had a background. Loads of people have got really good backgrounds in strength and conditioning, and the
Mm-hmm.
industry kind of polices itself. So the level of coaching that I see anywhere that I've been to a CrossFit gym is actually really high. It's probably the best I've ever seen anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
What and I said this on Paul Check's podcast as well, is that there's this kind of in between space from we want them to have the best form,
Mm-hmm.
perfect form, but we're taking something like Olympic lifting and
Mm-hmm.
then we're adding the components of endurance to something that
Mm-hmm.
was never designed for endurance.
Yes. Yes.
So what happens is that if they're not scaling the weight or changing the weight as they fatigue,
Mm.
then they're going to compensate with an adaptive movement due to fatigue or maybe
Yeah.
pain,
Yeah.
and that's where the danger comes in the sense
Yeah.
of they're doing a compensatory movement to just to get the weight up. They're chasing the reps rather than
Yeah.
focusing on form. That will still be evident in any workout. So I'm quite consistent. So I will have a series of plates there. If the weight gets too heavy for me, then I'll just deload.
Yeah.
If the movement gets too much for me and I can't maintain form, then I'll go to the next regression of the movement.
Mm. Mm.
And what I see happening is that people go, no, I've started with this exercise, I must finish with this exercise,
Right.
regardless if this is going to cause me a mischief,
Yes. Yes.
or it's going to overload my tissues. Because
Mm.
most of the people get away with CrossFit because they're under the age of 35, they're fit and healthy.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you're over the age of 35, maybe struggling to recover, that's when I see the spike of injuries. In the over 35s, it's far more common than the under 35s.
Yeah. Of course. Of course. I think part of the success, but also part of the danger of CrossFit is the fact it's a group environment. And I think one of the things I love about it is that they're trying to create this sense of tribe, and there's a lot of kind of certainly from my experience, the idea that you leave your ego at the door and it's a team environment, you're encouraging people. And so the guys that finish first will stop and support the rest of the group and so on. But I suppose the challenge with that is that, and again, having experienced it by doing quite a few sessions, I'm certainly not an expert, but I've been to the local box a few times, and each time the workout is phenomenal in terms of how hard you push yourself. But as you begin to fatigue, it's very difficult to not keep pushing because everyone's watching, cheering you on. Of course, there's people there that are fitter than you. For guys that feel like they should be doing better than the girls, but the girls are beating them, that's an issue. Or for the young people that feel they should be doing well, but there's older people there that are beating them. It kind of creates this sense of drive in the individual that's training, which may lead into, like you say, loss of form and potential injury. So that I don't know how you get around that, but it's like I say, it's a strength because you push yourself and because there's this team sense, but it's also a potential weakness as well from an injury risk perspective, I'd say. I don't know if there's any solutions to that, but I imagine it is what it is.
Yeah, the community needs to take responsibility for and identify themselves at these different levels,
Yeah.
because people are focusing. They're very task orientated. I'm here to do this workout. This is a piece of work. When I finish that work is when I am done. And that's great because it creates intensity. We've got people working together, and you always work better and you'll push yourself harder if you're competing against someone. But that's the double-edged sword, isn't it? And what I see is I see a lot of people with effectively niggles. I've had Achilles tendinopathy for, I don't know, 6 months to a year. I've had this kind of shoulder rotator cuff related pain for about a year. And then they're accumulating these injuries without actually really stopping, being educated about it, or doing the corrective exercise around it. I think we've got this thing at Bulletproof Bodies where we call it the compensation WOD. It's all the stuff that you're not doing in CrossFit that will make you a better CrossFitter.
Oh, nice. That sounds like a great concept.
And that's, well, yeah, and that's really through my gymnastic background, because it's all the stuff that we used to do, like a lot of isometric shoulder work. Because all these people are doing this high-level gymnastic things like bar muscle-ups, ring muscle-ups, without the necessary conditioning for the lower trapezius and the serratus anterior. So and there's whenever you're dealing with a hybrid sport, you got people coming in from Olympic lifting, gymnastics, rugby, football, hockey, whatever. They are individuals coming to a particular activity where it's a kind of one size fits all, and that doesn't really work. So we've got to be mindful of how that individual moves, and the assessment that we do is, what are their movement patterns like? Have they got a long torso and short legs? Short torso, long legs? What's their squat pattern like? What's their hip hinge pattern like? And analyzing and assessing these things before they begin any sort of workout, a kind of pre-participation screening. Obviously, with the functional movement screen, we know that the literature is quite clear, and from my study as well, we can't predict injury, but we can have a good look at how someone's moving, and kind of tidy up the movement. So something I notice in people with lower back pain is when you get them to hip hinge, they tend to spinal flex first rather than hip hinge first. So kind of a default. I don't know whether you've experienced that at all.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very common finding, isn't it, in clinical practice? And if you just take it back to the standard sort of lumbar pelvic rhythm type view of it, then it's all about load sharing, isn't it? Load sharing between, when you bend forwards in the lumbar pelvic rhythm, you're looking for load sharing between the hip and the spine, and hopefully that movement is shared nicely between the two areas, between lumbar flexion and hip flexion. But when you're not using your hips so much and you're moving more through the spine, then of course across a period of time you're creating more wear and tear potentially, or more fatigue in that area, potentially creating segmental instability if you're overusing that area, and so you're not sharing well between the hips and the spine. So then of course when you end up with pain, to start using the hips when you've not been used to using the hips, it's a motor pattern you haven't yet formed, is something that obviously feels foreign to that individual. So yeah, I've seen that a lot, which is obviously it's part of why I think hip back dissociation and finding a neutral spine is an important component of the rehabilitation process, because really it's teaching a new motor strategy. It's teaching proprioception, so the person actually knows what's going on in their spine rather than just going to a default pattern that has obviously irritated them. But a really important proviso there is that you want to move beyond the neutral spine in the longer term, or the hip hinge, or whatever you want to call it. And so, one of the things, because part of the reason I'm just going into this is that, of course, there's been quite a lot of criticism of posture, of biomechanics, of neutral spine, this kind of thing, as being related to pain, and essentially people saying that it's over focused upon. And there may be some truth to that, but I think it's important not to completely throw it out as well, because there's good rationale for adopting a neutral spine, for example, such as, the transversus abdominis and the stabilizer musculature switches on better in a neutral spine than it does when you're flexed, because the moment you flex or the moment you extend, the ligamentous system or the passive system is taking more of the loads, and the spine is more stable in that position, because essentially you're doing what any manual therapist would do if they're trying to manipulate a joint. Generally, a joint manipulation, what you're trying to do is to take the joint to a position where it's got no more range of motion. So in the neck, for example, you would flex, side bend, right, let's say rotate left. And by adding those vectors in, you're limiting the range of motion in the joint. And so then what that means is that then it only takes a small thrust and the joint will pop. So if you think of that in a more functional environment, if the spine's in neutral, then it's got its most number of options in terms of which way it can go. As soon as you start to add flexion into the spine, or flexion and side bending, flexion rotation, combination of all of those things, then the spine starts to lock down. And that means you have less range of motion before you hit a barrier, in other words, before you start to stress the passive subsystem. And so the analogy I like to use when I'm talking about this is it's like playing tennis, So if you were to be flexed in the spine, well, that's like playing tennis all from the front of the court. And sooner or later, your opponent's going to suss it out and lob you, right? If you're extended in the spine, it's like playing tennis from the back of the court. And sooner or later, you're going to get a drop shot hit on you. Or, out to the right, it will be on the right side of the court, out to the left side of the court. Or right rotated might be you can only do forehand. So no matter where the ball comes on the court, you've got to try and rotate right so that you can use your forehand, right? So the analogy is relates to the spine, is that if you want to play the game well, if you want to be able to perform optimally and minimize risk of losing or injury, could be another way to put that, then to get back to the center of the court and make that your default position is probably your best strategy.
I love that. Can I have that?
You can.
That is a great analogy. But yeah, I wanted to touch on this as well. Obviously, I'm a yoga teacher that specializes in back pain. I'm a Pilates instructor, and I've been working with core stability for a long while, and I think it is kind of misunderstood in the sense of what that means. And you've got people like, back to Peter O'Sullivan, where he's come across individuals who have become hypervigilant, because before you move, you've got to switch your core on. And well-meaning therapists have iatrogenically created an issue. And he's got this big piece around look what core stability did, and look at the damage it's done. And he's got some really good case studies around that, which I think is great. However, that isn't what my community is about. My extreme sports community need their core stability. So if I'm, I was at Ninja Warrior the other day, doing some slacklining, I need to be switching on my core. Otherwise I'm going to fall off the obstacle. Otherwise I'm going to fall off the slackline. If I'm kayaking, I need to be switching on my core so that, I can drive that core to extremity, when I'm paddling. And if I'm lifting heavy, I need to recruit everything. And I need to be taught how to do that. So, while, your average Joe, we're in danger of creating hypervigilance. If you're dealing with extreme conditioning or extreme athletes, they need every bit of help they can get. And so, it's horses for courses, isn't it? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the issues with the observations that Peter O'Sullivan's made is not that they're wrong, but that they have probably come about partly because of this whole thing of trends that occur in rehabilitation or in manual therapies or whatever. So when core stability is a big thing, people jump in and say, oh, you've got to pre-contract and you've got to activate and you've got to squeeze and draw the navel in. And if you don't keep up to speed with the new developments that are occurring the whole time, then, like certainly I went on a course with Diane Lee in 2003. So that's quite a long time back. And she was saying, no, we must not be teaching people to draw in. What we need to do is we need to encourage them to use a feeling command, or you as a therapist use a feeling command rather than a doing command. Because if you use a feeling command, like for example, imagine there's a string between your tummy button and your spine, and someone's gently tugging on that. So that's a very different command to saying draw your navel to your spine. Okay, so the former is a feeling command, and the latter is a doing command. And she was making the point essentially in another way of saying it is that when you give a doing command, what it means is that you activate your phasic system, because the phasic system is about moving you, it's about doing stuff. But when you give a feeling command, it's much more subtle and it activates more the tonic system. So you get this subtle drawing in of the transversus abdominis as a result of that feeling command. And so that's the kind of level of activation that we want, and minimizes this kind of over bracing, over protective behavior that Peter O'Sullivan's observed, which, and absolutely, I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying if people had done it the way Diane describes it, probably we would have had less issues. Now that's one aspect, but there's many other aspects as well, such as, this whole notion that what you want to do with any client, with any person that's rehabilitating or learning a new lift, let's say, is that you start out with them. Imagine you're teaching someone in CrossFit to do a power clean. They've never lifted before. That's quite a complex movement pattern under load. And so they're going to start out as what will be termed an unconscious incompetence. So they don't even know what a power clean is. But you essentially say to them, okay, this is how you do it. This is the technique, et cetera, et cetera. Give them all the breakdown and the tips. And so now they become a conscious incompetence. They know how to do it, but they still haven't done it and they haven't mastered it. So they've gone from unconscious incompetent to conscious incompetent. Next thing is they give it a go. And with various feedback, they hopefully, let's say they get to a point quite quickly if they're coordinated and have a bit of lifting experience. They're going to get to a point where they are consciously competent, where so long as they're concentrating and they're thinking through all the keys and key kind of cues that have been given to them, they can do a reasonably good power clean. So now they're consciously competent, but you need to get to the point where you're unconsciously competent to be really effective in your power clean. And that's that same process works with anything from learning to play tennis, learning to swing a golf club, or indeed learning to reactivate your transversus abdominis or your multifidus or whatever it might be. It has to start out with, first of all, the client doesn't know why they're in pain. The practitioner identifies, well, look, your transversus isn't firing. It seems to be inhibited in some way. Okay. So that the unconscious incompetence of the patient now becomes conscious incompetent. They are now aware why they're in pain. So the next thing is, this is how you activate the transversus abdominis. So you activate it using a feeling command, not a doing command. So now they can do it whenever they consciously think about that feeling command, they can activate the transversus abdominis. Fantastic. But you still haven't finished rehabilitating them yet, because they need to get to the point where they are unconsciously competent. And the issue with that is that it takes a lot of repetition to achieve that. So, if you've got a dedicated client or patient, then they're likely to achieve that. But there's several other things that can inhibit that possibility. One is that they may have viscerosomatic reflexes going on. That's a very common one, that if you've got an inflamed gut of some sort, or an inflamed uterus, or an inflamed prostate, or a bladder issue, then all of those things, all of those viscera reflects back to the spinal cord. What we know a viscerosomatic reflex will do is it will inhibit the tonic motor neurons at the cord level, which will then go back and affect the motor, because they're the tonic neurons, the tonic motor neurons, they're affecting the tonic fibers of the segments that have been affected. Okay, so quite often that will be from those organs I just mentioned. It will be the lower abdominal wall, the key part to stabilize the pelvis and low back. So the point is that the person can't ever make that leap from being a conscious competent to being an unconscious competent unless the physical therapist is working with visceral health and visceral function, which means with nutrition and with lifestyle and so on. And unfortunately, in the manual medicines, or musculoskeletal medicine, let's say, that's exactly what it has been. It's been musculoskeletal without looking at visceral health and hormonal health and psychological health. So the skill set and the assessments and the tools that we use are all targeted towards musculoskeletal nuts and bolts of the body, and not looking at the viscerosomatic reflexes and so on and so forth. So that's I think a huge reason why people like Peter O'Sullivan are finding those kinds of results, because we're not dealing with the whole organism.
Yeah, we talk about this quite often. Actually, we tend to be reductionists. If we take something down to the minutiae, fix the minutiae, then build them back up again, they should be fine. But
Yeah.
if you look at Paul Chek's 4 doctors model, if we're looking at if you and I are looking at doctor movement exclusively, we can only ever get someone the 25%
Yeah,
better,
that's it.
and that's all we can do, because we haven't addressed how they're sleeping, how they're recovering, or what they're eating, or what their goals are, what they need to get back to.
Yeah.
And you know a lot more about this than I do, but the holistic message, and this is what I try and get through to my students, is that as a physical therapist, rather than the title, anyone doing stuff to you physically, I can only get you a quarter of the way there, and then you potentially need to see other people, or you need that physical therapist to also be skilled in nutrition. And that's where osteopathy is so much better than physiotherapy, because physiotherapy, is, we already have dietitians who would say, oh no, that's our role
Yes.
within this kind of NHS setting. Why would the physio possibly want to do that? But if you have a qualification in nutrition, obviously nutrition was my first qualification, particularly sports nutrition, then I would always give some sort of nutritional support along with what I'm doing. I'm not a skilled counselor, although I'm sure most therapists do counseling as well.
Certainly, yeah.
And then, I'm not a sleep hygienist, but I know enough about sleep, and with all the techno apps that we can use, we can monitor those things. How much of that kind of model do you use with your patients?
Well, that is the model, really. It's the interesting thing is, I think the more you study these different fields, the more you see they overlap, and they interact. So, for example, the examples you just gave there, if someone's got sleep issues, then there's a few obvious reasons why they may be getting them. One is stress management. So you need to be able to counsel them, give them various self-help tools, exercises such as zone exercises, or Tai Chi, or meditation, mindfulness, those kinds of things. So you need to have a little bit of awareness of that. Now, other reasons why someone might not sleep is that they're eating the wrong kind of macronutrient ratios for their physiology, or for the demands on their system, which means that a classic one is that people tend to overconsume carbohydrates, particularly in the evenings. It's where we tend to go for our treat, or for our pint of beer, or whatever it is to relax in the evening, the chocolate, the dessert, etc., etc. And the challenge there is that if you've already had a meal that's relatively high carb, like most vegetarian meals, or pasta-based meals, or whatever, then the blood sugar will go right up after the meal, which is very normal after a high carb meal. And then you'll get a strong insulin release, which will make you feel sleepy, because your blood sugar will drop back down. So now your energy drops down. You feel ready for bed, which is great. So you go off to bed. But the problem is that as you're going off to sleep in this kind of dulled down state, because of the insulin being high and the blood sugar therefore being low, what happens is, if that blood sugar drops below what's called the functional physiological range, then it triggers you to release cortisol. So then your cortisol is the only thing, unless you were to eat some sugar in the middle of the night, your blood sugar is not going to come up again unless you release cortisol. And cortisol is what mobilizes the stored sugar, the glycogen from our liver, from our muscles, to bring the blood sugar levels back up again. The problem with that is that cortisol is antagonistic to melatonin, which is your primary sleep hormone. So essentially you end up either having a broken night's sleep, or an agitated night's sleep, or indeed you have insomnia. So you've got the you've got the nutrition, you've got the kind of doctor happiness, if you like, and finding time to have self time and introspection. Then of course another reason people don't sleep is because they've been relatively inactive all day. They've been sat at a desk all day. They haven't actually expended any great energy. So one of the tricks to improving insomnia is to exercise more, but to exercise ideally earlier in the day, ideally outside, so you're getting sunlight on the skin. That helps to reset your circadian rhythm, and so on and so forth. But I suppose back to your point is that which part of that is just sleep hygiene, and which part of it is nutrition, and which part of it is counseling, and which part of it is exercise professional. It's like this. Unless you've got an overview of how it all integrates, then, and we have a nice image of that in our Ghost in the Machine paper, actually, that Paul Check and I wrote last year. And it's just kind of showing the 4 doctors and showing how, if you remove one of those doctors, then it really impacts on all of the other systems. So you can't, it's what would be termed an irreducible system. The moment you remove one of them, let's say you take Dr. Diet out of the equation, well, now that's going to impact on your sleep. It's going to impact on your energy levels to move. It's going to impact on your happiness, because we know that what foods we eat can dramatically affect our mood. And we know that if we aren't eating well, it'll dramatically affect our sleep. And then our sleep will also affect our mood. And similarly, if we're not eating well, it will affect our desire to exercise. And if we don't exercise, that also affects our mood. So, it's like you can't take one of them away and still be effective. You've got to be working with all of them, either as a group of clinicians working together in a nice tight-knit way, or as an individual holistic clinician.
That's the revolutionary healthcare figure 5, isn't it? The wheel.
Yes.
That you're talking to.
So the wheel is that's actually from our most recent paper. The one I was thinking of was actually from last year, from the Ghost in the Machine paper, or was it the Working with the Ghost in the Machine paper? I'll look it up while we're talking. But I tell you what, one thing I was going to mention, which still relating to CrossFit, was one of the sort of criticisms, as you've alluded to, is the injury rate in CrossFit. And I seem to remember we talked about this, but I actually found a paper which was in the Journal of Sport Rehabilitation by Ashbeck, Brook, and Dural, and it was called "Are Injuries More Common with CrossFit Training Than Other Forms of Exercise?" And essentially, they were comparing CrossFit to weightlifting, distance running, track and field, rugby, football, ice hockey, soccer. So football being American football, soccer, or gymnastics. And what they actually found was that there was very little difference in injury between all of those sports. And so what they were saying was that CrossFit isn't any more injurious than taking up one of those other sports. So those that are kind of a bit negative about CrossFit, if you look at the stats, then it doesn't really stack up that there's more injuries. I suppose from my perspective, and this is where I'm interested, for your point of view, is I guess people often don't see CrossFit as a sport. They see it as kind of like going to the gym. And so the gym is, in inverted commas, a bit safer than going out on a competitive field of play where there's a lot more randomness and multiple factors that have to be controlled for. So you would think in a gym environment that you'd be safer. So the kind of flip side to looking at this is that yet you're still getting injured as much in CrossFit as you are, say, in a rugby match or in a soccer match or whatever. So, or ice hockey. So what's your take on that? And I'm sure you've seen a lot more studies than I have. But
Yeah, well, I've got a particular interest in injury rates across, but my interest is in extreme sports as well. Rather, there's so many rugby, football, hockey, netball physios out there. My interest is more in the extreme. But if we look at basketball, for example, so injury rates are measured like per 1,000 hours as well. So you do 1,000 hours of this particular activity, and these are the injury rates that are common.
Mm-hmm.
So basketball. So a study by Picari. So roughly you'll get 9 injuries per 9.1 per 1,000 hours of training. If we look at running, again, Picari, the Picari study is the one I'm going to use. 3.6 per 1,000 hours of training, but CrossFit's coming in between 2.4, which is the Weissenthal study, or the Giordano study, or the Hack study, which is 3.1.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
so it's actually much lower than we think. So if we look at elite sort of weightlifting and gymnastics, that's roughly the same rate that the gymnasts are getting injured.
Okay.
We look at triathletes, 4.6 per 1,000 hours of training. That's from the Burns study. Tennis, 4.7. So because and really it's the classification of
Yeah.
are we talking about CrossFit the sport, or are we talking about CrossFit the training methodology?
Yeah.
And maybe we need to dissociate the two there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got data from all the CrossFit competitions,
Right.
and I've also got data from CrossFit. I ran a CrossFit clinic for a long while,
Mm-hmm.
and I still see a lot of CrossFit athletes. But if we look at the injuries that occur, they're all the same: shoulder and lower back.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And obviously, wrist and knee and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of injury rates, you're far more likely to get injured playing rugby or football or basketball
Okay.
than you are doing, CrossFit.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I suppose one last thing on the CrossFit tack is that one of the things that concerned me a little bit, knowing a bit about what we've just been discussing, which is essentially, the 4 doctors and the idea that there could be stress on all of the systems, and that therefore we need to manage all of those systems. Many people that are, let's say, a little bit out of shape, or they want to lose weight, they are in that state because there's a lot of stress on their systems, because they're not sleeping so well, because they're not eating so well, because they're not moving so well, and so on. So then they may think, okay, I'm going to go to CrossFit, and hopefully that will, with the kind of burn calories mentality, or with the, the vision that they've seen online of all these ripped CrossFit athletes. So they kind of go down to the local box. But, my experience and having seen, various people involved in CrossFit over the last decade or so, it seems like there's obviously not a lot of screening for what we would call in the check system physiological load. So in other words, the level of stress that the system is under. And yet CrossFit is quite a strong stress stimulus, let's say, because it's working out typically for an hour at a time, and obviously people get encouraged to go as regularly as they can, which is great. But what's your experience of seeing people essentially burn out, or to get unwell, or to get to a point where there's so many injuries they can't seem to get back into the box or into the swing of things?
Yeah, we talked about this before about like the thing about CrossFit is a victim of its own success. These people want to go every day.
Yeah.
And they also want to bang the drum every day,
Yeah.
and try and get a new record at this or a new record at that, and try and they think that every day is going to be their best day.
Yeah.
And there's a big education process of it's the invincibility fable of youth, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm young, I'm fit, therefore I think the principles of exercise don't apply to me. So there's some naivety around that, and there's some ego around that, and I've definitely battled against some of that, I can tell you.
Of course.
I think the whole process needs to be a bit more. Where I come in is that we're doing more sort of pre-participation screening,
Okay.
effectively after the horse has already bolted. They're already doing CrossFit, and then we've got to address how many times a week are they training. So we've got some interesting stuff about if you train less than 3 times a week in CrossFit, you are actually more likely to get injured.
Okay, interesting.
So there's like a level of physical adaptation. So by training 3 times a week, that's the sweet spot. If you train less than 3 times a week, you're not doing enough physiological load to get the driver that could be protective.
Yes. Okay.
Things like plyometrics will be low-level plyometrics can be protective, as we know. Whereas if you're training every day, and even on your rest days, you're still doing stuff that is creating huge amounts of stressors,
Mm.
and you don't understand about catabolism and that anabolic effect, that we need that rest and recovery.
Yeah.
And you're then you see a lot of people burn out, or the classic tired all the time, but they don't want to give up because they're addicted to the environment,
Hmm.
and they're addicted to this feeling. All of a sudden, their self-worth is attached to the workout of that day,
Yeah.
and then we're into a whole dangerous place of being somewhere we shouldn't. What are your views on that?
Yeah, so I think that the challenge is that with these groups is that they obviously are coming, as we said already, from a position where they already have quite a high level of physiological loads, and so what we talk about in the check system is that quite frequently, well, the model is what we call the 1, 2, 3, 4 model, and 1 stands for finding the dream or the goal or the sort of one love, the legacy, maybe even your life's purpose. So that's kind of the 1. What's your overarching dream, the focus for why you're there, rather than it being a short-term goal. Like I want to lose weight, or I want to get abs so I can see in the mirror, or whatever. It's like, well, how does that fit into a bigger lifestyle or bigger vision for your life? But then it's the 2 forces. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 2 is the 2 forces, and so what we're looking at there is how yin are they versus how yang are they, and essentially yin is the feminine principle. It's about darkness and rest and sleep and nutrition and hydration. Yang is about brightness and activity and movement and inflammation and breaking things down, destruction, etc., etc. Now, most people's lifestyles, when you look at it in that kind of metaphorical context, their lives are too yang. They're not getting enough exposure to the dark. They're getting overexposure to the light. They're busy, busy, go, go, go. They're often eating pro-inflammatory diets and pro-inflammatory foods and drinks. The coffee culture is just one big yang hit, right? So the thing is, then perhaps as a result of that, they start to get fatigued or put on weight or whatever it is. They decide they need to get down to CrossFit, and then we add more yang to the yang, and the problem is that we really need to first unload them. We need to make them more yin before we start building up the yang again. So my view is that in an ideal world, when people approach a CrossFit box, what they would do really well to initiate is essentially an unloading phase. Not a you don't start with base conditioning. You start with an unloading phase. So let's teach them to stretch. Let's teach them to do Tai Chi. Let's teach them to do Qigong. Let's teach them how to eat. Let's teach them how to sleep. Let's teach them how to be hydrated. That's the first 8 weeks of the program, and see how you feel with that, because you actually get strong if you stretch effectively. In other words, if you have someone that can assess your muscle imbalance profile quite quickly, which should be quite doable to a skilled practitioner, you actually get stronger by stretching, because you stretch the muscles that are facilitated and overutilizing neural drive. So a classic one is the pec minor is often facilitated, and what it's doing is it's stealing neural drive from the serratus anterior and the rhomboids, and perhaps middle trapezius. So you could go working that rhomboid, middle trapezius, serratus anterior to try and make it work. But if the neural drive's going to the pec minor because it's facilitated, you're going to have no or a minimal effect. But if you can defacilitate, in other words, to inhibit the pec minor, then just immediately as a result of inhibiting it, which is what stretching does, it inhibits muscles, then instantaneously you get greater drives to serratus and to lower trapezius, middle trapezius, etc. And so then you've actually gained strength by stretching. So it's like a no strengthening strength program, if you like, or there's a no effort strength program. Let's put it that way, because you're just stretching. So I would say that would be a kind of optimal way to do it, if you could make it juicy enough that people would actually stick to it. And just on that point, one of the things that's why you start out with the one love and with the legacy and the purpose and so on, because what you're trying to do is create a bigger picture, a more long-term picture for what the person's trying to achieve. And of course that's their life's purpose, but you could bring it down. This is what we teach in the check system, is if you could do a macro periodization. which is great for business, of course. So as a business model, to do a macro periodization for someone essentially means doing a periodization for a season, for a year, right? So if you did a 1 year periodization as the first thing you did in CrossFit and said, so here's your next year's plan. The first 8 weeks, we're going to unload you. The next 8 weeks, we're going to put you through base conditioning. The next 8 weeks, we're going to go into whatever, strength, endurance, performance conditioning, etc. That's the way we do it in the check system. So you're unloading the system, decreasing the yang, making them more yin. So essentially they're more balanced. And then because they're balanced and because you've built a foundation for them, now they can grow their building taller without any risk of it toppling.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and I know the Czech Institute does a great job on that. So really, what we're doing is we're adding fitness to a movement problem, which we have to be very, very cautious of doing. So promoting dysfunctional movement over just getting them to move right in the first place.
Yeah.
So a lot of my work is trying to undo the bad habits that people have learned, because I'm not in the advantageous position to get them in that first position, and that's why I'm going into the young military officer cadets, and showing them at the very beginning of their career how to move well, and how to make sure that the movement patterns that they have are correct before you start adding load, speed, or fatigue to them. So that's a great way of doing stuff, because we don't want to be trying to solve a movement problem with a fitness solution.
Absolutely. And of course that leads beautifully into talking about the current sort of project with the military, because you're still serving in the military, aren't you? And
as a reservist,
yes. And so I know that you've had Gavin Jennings from Czech Europe come in to do a presentation on the primal patterns and so on, and you've got this system. Is it the Thor THOR? Is that?
Yeah. So that's training for human optimization and readiness.
Okay. So can you tell us a little bit about that and how they interface?
Yeah. So what's happened is the British military is changing more in the last 2 to 3 years than it has in the last 2 to 300.
Wow.
So we've got multiple things going on. We've got a new system, so the Virtus system, which is a new sort of webbing system that's state of the art. It's got a weight distribution device that allows you to effectively customize the load that you could have on your back. We've got women going into the infantry for the first time.
Right.
And we've also just changed the way that we're training people physically. So everything used to be around the 2 minutes of press ups, 2 minutes of sit ups, and a 1.5 mile run best effort time, and that was basically our fitness test. It was very much in the dark ages. So that's now been brought forward with our new physical employment standards. So they're still teasing them out at the moment as well, but they'll be effectively marching with load and running, this time only 2K, but they'll be done in a specific way. It's been educationally informed, I think, from the University of Chichester, and lots of stuff from St Mary's in Twickenham, just down the road from you, in terms of strength and conditioning. So we're now doing a standing broad jump, an L-sit med ball power throw, effectively. Pull-ups are back in. Deadlifting is back in, and there's a lot, and obviously sprints as well. So they've gone down the functional route. And when we went to the presentation, they were talking about 7 primal patterns, and I was like, well, 7 functional movements. So I was like, oh, this looks very similar to Paul Chek's primal patterns that he did all the way back in the 90s. You haven't just liberated that, have you?
That's the way to say it, is it? Liberated.
Well, yeah, you haven't just set it free. And he goes, oh no, this has all come from the George Herbert stuff, and MoveNat and all that sort of thing. And I was like, I'm not so. You are aware that lots of people from the PT Corps went and came and did the pull check course.
Yeah.
So there might be a little disclosure there. Anyway, so by the by, that's come into that. So
Yeah.
there's lots of stuff going on with the regular soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
But the military is relying more heavily on its reserve forces than ever before.
Right.
So there's a missing piece of the puzzle there. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to serve that military community by making sure that we do lots of injury prevention stuff. So in my unit, 207 Field Hospital, we've been doing functional movement screening for the last nearly 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a look at how someone's moving and assess their movement before I give them a program to load them up before they can then go into these new physical tests.
Right.
Because, if you've got someone that's never deadlifted before
Mm-hmm.
and now they're going for a 1 repetition max, that's potentially hazardous. So there's an education piece around that.
Yeah.
If you've got someone that's sprinting, which is our highest level gait skill, and they haven't done any sprinting for a long period of time, they're going to be causing themselves all sorts of mischief. So Gavin and I are hopefully putting stuff together that will be using the check principles to inform their version of functional movement.
Right.
There will be the people that can do
Mm-hmm.
because they're young, they're fit, they're determined, and they don't have any health issues.
Yeah.
But it's the other people that maybe drive a desk, or they're coming back into physical activity after doing a staff role, or they've been out on a language course and then for 2 years and then they're coming back into the system. These are the people that will need to be just adequately assessed and adequately reconditioned. It's great that the military's changed it into these functional movements, but realistically, although we see a lot of girls doing pull-ups in CrossFit, how many girls can knock out 10 pull-ups that are coming straight off the street without the time to do all that conditioning around it? We've got most guys can barely do 5 pull-ups.
Yeah, absolutely.
And their weight distribution is in their shoulders, rather than ladies, it tends to be in their pelvis and hips.
Yeah. For sure.
So there's big educational pieces around that, and obviously nobody thinks about injury prevention. Nobody thinks about prehabilitation. Nobody thinks about getting the physios and the healthcare professionals involved in before the process starts. And that's my big bugbear.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, because wasn't that was part of what I think you've been liaising on with Gavin, was this idea of using some of the check materials, or integrating them at least into a kind of prehabilitation type of approach. And so is that something that is a just a plan at the moment, or is there's actually steps being taken in that direction?
Well, here I have to hold my hands up and say I'm guilty of being too busy at the moment. That was my bag. That's something in the pipeline.
Right,
Gavin left that firmly with me, and I've been finding excuses not to do it. I'm busy doing podcasts and things like that.
Yeah, I know. What a slacker.
Exactly. So it's something we're definitely going to get into.
Excellent.
And there's opportunities there, because also people are hungry for that knowledge as well. I can't feel that people are given a half truth these days.
Yeah.
And particularly, I use the Czech Institute as my kind of secret weapon, if you like, because I know how everything relates to everything else, as do you.
Yeah.
And that may be missing in some of my fellow clinicians.
Sure.
The other thing is that I'm authentic in the sense that I do CrossFit, I do barefoot running, I eat clean, I sleep well, I make sure I get regular exercise. So I need to use all the same products for my own fitness as well. So, I foam roll, or using a pulse roll, vibrational foam roller. I use Compex as part of my competition recovery.
Sure.
I make sure I'm doing yoga every day. And that way, the athletes that come to me, they know I'm authentic. And there's a big piece around, you got to be, careful that you're not just talking a good game, but you're actually, and it comes back to that analogy, do you even lift?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Very good. Excellent. Well, I think that's probably covered most of the questions that I had. One thing, because I know that functional exercise has obviously been your thing for many years now. But when did you see that starting to, I guess, influence or filter into the forces? And in particular, when you're working with the elite forces, were they doing functional exercise before you got there, or was that something that you helped to instigate? Or what was the sort of pattern that you saw there?
Well, that's a great question. So basically, coming from the army, so I was army first. It was press ups, sit ups, mile and a half run, and we didn't, and then tabbing, which is, effectively moving from point A to point B with a pack on as fast as you can up
Right,
hills.
right, yeah,
But it wasn't until I got to the Marines, the Royal Marines, that the Royal Marines were doing functional training.
right,
Okay, and their methodology for training people was progressive.
yeah.
Um,
And when was this?
so this is I joined the Marines back in '99.
Okay.
So yeah, it's quite a long while, and this functional training was very consistent, particularly when I met Paul Check in 2001. I'd just been going through all this functional training with the Marines, things like fireman's carries,
Yeah.
and it was more kind of be fit to be useful.
Yeah,
What can be more useful than a fireman's carry?
yeah.
And rope climbing. And yeah, we did weights, but we didn't do a huge amount of weights. It was all body weight, and we do some deadlifts and some squats, but the majority of it was kind of calisthenic fitness.
Yeah.
And then Iraq and Afghanistan kicked off, and you got this kind of merging of troops. So probably about 2009, 2010, when Afghanistan was in its full flow. You've got American forces, Canadian, you got the Brits, you got Australia, New Zealand, then you've got other countries like Denmark, Romania. So basically, you put all these alpha people together, all these alpha males together, and you get them in a gym.
Yeah.
So what do you think they're going to do? They're going to do stuff that's showy. And then all of a sudden, people come and say, "Oh, what are you doing there? What are you doing here?" And this is where, but basically, everyone discovered sort of cross training, as opposed to, CrossFit was there, but people were doing other types of training.
Yeah.
And it was a great learning environment, and that's where everyone switched, and then the whole barefoot movement kicked off, and the functional movement kicked off.
Yeah.
Because before that, it was just you were either a runner or you were a bodybuilder, and that didn't really fit with what I was when I was a Royal Marine.
Yeah.
I was a functionally fit person.
Yeah.
And I wasn't a bodybuilder. I wasn't a runner. I was kind of both. And then the CrossFit model was the one that competed, because to be, I don't know, king of the castle in a sense. Whereas, because it was everything, it was a bit of bodybuilding, it was a bit of cardio, it was everything, and people all these soldiers were pushing each other to be fitter, like who was the fittest, who was the strongest, who was this, who was that. And we got this kind of fusion of all these different trainings, and it was a really great place to be around. The gym was always fun, people was doing crazy stuff, and that for me is where sort of functional movement kicked off, and we changed the way that we trained forever.
Right.
Once you've done a CrossFit workout, you're not going to go back and start bodybuilding again. You might do a little bit of that, but because you've experienced the gains of function and fitness together, you're incorporating a gymnastic movement, an Olympic lifting movement, a powerlifting movement, and a metabolic conditioning workout in one. It's the best of all worlds.
Excellent. Great stuff. Well, look, Dale, we've spent a long time on the call, so I think we should wrap it up there. Obviously, you mentioned the image from we were talking about an image from one of the papers. It's actually figure 3 in Working with the Ghost in the Machine, which I'll post that image on the show notes on my website, mattwallden.com, under the podcast tab. So if you want to see that image, I'll pop that up there. But thanks so much for your time and for sharing all of that real wealth of expertise and experience. It's been fantastic to chat through it all with you. We could have gone on for a lot longer, I think.
Yeah, the trouble when we meet up, Matt, it's normally a couple of coffees later and we're still going. We haven't even scratched the surface.
That's it. Yeah. But maybe we'll do another one down the line. But thanks so much for today. And if people want to learn more about your work, and because I know you've got a book you've been working on, and obviously you're still working clinically. So what details can you share with them as to how they can get hold of you?
Yeah, really on my blog site on Blogger, which is Don't Get Cross Get Fit, bulletproofbodies.blogspot That's where I'm posting most of my new stuff. You can find me on Facebook at Bulletproof Physio with the 0. You can find me on most of the socials as well. Bulletproof Bodies 1 on Insta. I always respond back to you. I've got loads of people that I do programming for, like internet conversations, sort of telehealth. And they're normally coming to me. I've got this injury. I've seen lots of people. No one's managed to get rid of it. What do you think it is? And then, a couple of well design tests and a bit of experience, and you can get to the bottom of things as well. But if you go on to my blog site, Don't Get Cross, Get Fit, there's a free ebook that myself and my business partner Uzo Ekiog have done. And we're working on the actual book, Don't Get Cross, Get Fit, at the moment, so that should be available Christmas time.
Fantastic. That's excellent. Well, like I say, thanks again, and I will post all of those details so that you've got the links available on the podcast tab on mattwallden.com. So just remains for me to say thanks again, Dale, and look forward to next time.
Absolute pleasure. You're very welcome, Matt.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Cheers now.
Thank you for joining us again on FC2O. I hope Dale's insights and experience have inspired you and given you some new perspectives. Please feel free to share this or any of the other episodes of the podcast with those you think would benefit and or enjoy it. Dale is contactable via bulletproofbodiessffit.com. So that's bulletproofbodies, S for sugar, F for foxtrot, fit.com. And he's also available at bulletproofbodies.blogspot.co.uk. And on that blogspot, you'll find access to a free ebook that he wrote with his business partner, Uzo Ekiog, called Don't Get Cross, Get Fit. Dale's also available on Bulletproof Physio on Facebook, and that's spelt Bulletproof and then FIZZY and 0, so Physio on Facebook, and then Bulletproof Bodies 1 on Insta. Thanks for joining us on FC2O. You can ensure you catch all future episodes by subscribing at Apple Podcasts or following us on Spotify or Stitcher. Please join us next time where we'll be interviewing Phil Austin, osteopath and PhD researcher into persistent pain. See you at the next show.